All right, and thank you everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ann Schaefer. I'm the Senior Customer Success Specialist here at MarketSight, and today we're going to talk about segmented analysis with variables. So we're going to be covering several different topics in regards to variables. First, we're going to discuss organizing and creating new variables, so making a large data set, for example, easier to navigate, as well as shortcuts in order to create variables more quickly. We'll discuss briefly the different variable types that are available to us, as well as go into examples on a couple of those variable types. We'll mention the new variable weighting wizard that is available, and of course we'll talk about updates that we have for you in terms of relabeling and recoding your variables. Finally, we're going to end today with reuse and importing, so means for reutilizing your UDVs, making things a little more convenient for you. All right, so let's switch over to MarketSight here. Now, let's head on to the variables page, of course, where we'll begin by taking a look at categorization. By default, when you upload your data set, all variables in your data set will be in the default uncategorized section. That's fine. You may not necessarily need to categorize your variables. But categories, such as survey info here or demographics, can be quite handy for organizing a very large data set or data sets where you might happen to have, similarly labeled variables, ones perhaps with labels so similar it can be difficult to distinguish which is the right variable to use in certain circumstances. In that case, categories can come in quite handy. There are also a couple of other tips and tricks with categories that we'll mention as we continue onward. Now, I do happen to have some uncategorized variables. For me, those are showing up on the second page of my data set here. If I scroll down towards the bottom, I'll see my uncategorized section where I see a number of different variables. To categorize multiple variables, I'll first want to select those on the variables list page. Note that I can select multiple at one time, so I certainly don't need to be categorizing these one at a time. Once I have them selected, I'll want to go to the Categorize menu up here in the top of the navigation. By default, they'll again be in uncategorized, but at this point you can create a new category to place them in, and in this case that's what I'll do. You can also choose from any previously created category you might have made in the past. In this case, I will call these keyword variables, and I'll go ahead and click OK. Now, the uncategorized category for me is going to completely disappear except for these last two. Again, very quick to just categorize those since I made that category, move them in, and now I should have no uncategorized variables at all. So categories can come in handy for managing a list page for another couple of reasons. If I take a look at my Manage Categories page here, I will see that I have a list of all my categories, and this is in fact a location where I can arrange my categories. For example, if I wanted to take survey info here and place it down towards the bottom of my list of variables instead of towards the top, all I need to do is click and drag that, and as I click and drag these variables, they'll be rearranged on the page. This is the order in which they'll be displayed, so that's something to keep in mind if you're looking to, say, take some variables you don't need and put them sort of in a different location, so to speak. I can also take variables and I can hide them completely. One common use would be to say, take predecessors or the underlying variables that are components of an MRV and place them into a category of their own. If those variables are in a category of their own, you can select that category here on the variables page, select visibility, and then choose to hide that category. Now, if that category is marked as hidden right here on this page, that means it's not going to show up on the variables page or even in the crosstab editor. So that's great for hiding variables that you may not want to see, just to make things, again, easier to navigate. Heading back to the variables page now, one thing you may also, of course, want to do when working on the variables page is create new user-defined variables to create segments or other groups for your analysis. Now, many of you are familiar with the traditional method of creating a new user-defined variable, in which I would say select New, Regrouping Variable, and then proceed to fill out this dialog. So if I say wanted to regroup age, for example, or even say create top 2 boxes, I would first need to search for that variable and then select my predecessor variable here in this drop-down before I could really begin. However, we've added a new shortcut that you may not be aware of. Now, in that particular case, I'm first going to search up here for my variable just to make it a little faster to find. And instead of going new and choosing regrouping, I'm actually going to right-click on this sort of row, if you will, of this variable. I now have a Create UDV shortcut located right here. What's especially nice about this shortcut is that when I select my variable type, this variable and its category are going to be pre-populated into this dialog. So as you can see here, my category selected from here, and then the variable that I had right-clicked on is already here for me in the predecessor variable component of my dialog. So in this case, I'm going to call this top 2, communique. And since I've already got this populated, I can simply click on Add Value, and I'm good to go. Just to keep things simple, we'll say something like All Others, and of course, make things easy for ourselves by choosing Select All. Now, since this is going to go into a category, when I click OK, I can actually go look for it. So let's say, for example, I'm looking at all the categories. Rather than just looking at all of those, I can head to that particular category, and I should see it there. So there's my top 2 right there. Now, that's an example of a regrouping variable where you might want to create something like a top 2 box, or you want to group values such as perhaps different states. You would like to group those into regions. But of course, we do have other kinds of user-defined variables that you can still make. One would be the conditional variable, which is a very common option. And in fact, there's an option about the conditionals that I do want to point out to you. Now, let's say we're going to call this gender/income, and I'll choose to place this into the demographics category. Now, at this point, when I click Add New Value, this is likely a familiar process to you. We'll say call this female under 20K. And as you might guess at this point, I'm going to search for the appropriate variables. So I'm going to select gender. We'll say equal to, in this case, female, add to definition. And they also need to make a certain income bracket. So I'm going to again search for my variable. Equal to is fine. And then I'm going to select that value, add to definition. Now, of course, as I'm doing this process, again, very familiar to you, so I'll just repeat this one more time. We'll say male under 20K. Again, we'll search for our variables, type in a search term and hit enter, select our operator and our value, add to definition. And again, search for income, operator and value, add to definition. Now, the shortcut that I specifically want to point out to you with the conditionals here, or I should say perhaps a little tip, is this Include All Others button right here. Once you have created at least one value within your conditional variable, you'll have this option. You'll be able to click on this button. As you can see, this is going to create logic automatically for you, which should include anybody that does not fall into one of your previously created categories. Even more important is this little checkbox here to include missing. There may be scenarios where a variable has perhaps some blank values. Respondents either didn't see that question, they skipped that question, and that particular cell was left blank. In that case, this is a great way to get those included in the total sample size. So if you do this, where you check the All Others button, and then check that Include Missing checkbox right here, you'll be able to include those missing cells, those missing respondents, and get your full sample size. Now I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and again, that's going to create my variable. And as before, if I take a quick look at my demographics category here, I'll be able to see that right here. All right, so that's an example of a conditional and something very important about those. Now, the other variable type that I did want to mention a little tip or trick about is going to be the multiple response variable. This is, again, another variable type that's very common. You may well be familiar with this. In fact, if you're working with SPSS data sets, you may not need to make these in MarketSight because MarketSight will actually preserve your SPSS file settings. It will bring in your multiple response variables for you. Now, on the other hand, if I need to create my variables within MarketSight, that's of course still fine. So I will call this by today's date. We'll say 11/13/18. A little scary that it's the 13th already, but there you have it. And then of course, we'll call this features. Now, the point that I want to make is that when you are creating a multiple response variable, what you are counting is going to be very important. So in the case of my cell phone features, which I want to count, I can expand my variables here, and I can see that in this case, the yes selection is 1. So by this, I know that my count only values equal to 1 option is going to work perfectly. But there can be other scenarios in which you have situations, where you actually have, say, multiple values, 1, 2, and 3. In that case, you would choose to count all values instead. So just keep in mind that when you're working with a multiple response variable, what you're counting here can be very important. I'm going to switch that back there, and I'm going to move over my cell phone features. This is in fact another area in which moving over categories can be quite handy because I can drag my category and it goes ahead and it places all of the variables within that category there for me. So that's another advantage to categorization. Now, I would of course hit OK to create that variable. So since I haven't placed this in a category, it's going to go back to that uncategorized grouping, but that's OK for this moment. So I'll go ahead and click OK to confirm that change. All right, so that is the multiple response and a little bit of information about a setting you'll want to be careful to take a look at. Continuing to move along briskly here, another area that I want to point out in MarketSight variables that you may not necessarily be familiar with is the ability to create weighting within MarketSight. Now, of course, you may already have a weighting variable that you created, and that's part of your data set, and that's perfectly fine. You can apply those either at the data set or the crosstab level. But if you don't have a weight variable, you can use MarketSight to create a new version. You would need to specify a name and a code, and then you get to actually build the variable itself. Now, of course, demographics are one common thing upon which we weight data. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll just drag over gender here. When I drag over gender, you'll see that my values appear. It'll show you the current sample size percentage, and then it'll have boxes for the target percentage. The idea here is that I want to make sure my target percentage for this variable adds up to 100%. That's really the primary concern there. I just need to make sure that percentage adds up to 100%. I can drag over additional variables. So if I wanted to, I could say take ethnicity. And again, as long as my values that I input add up to 100%, I'm A-OK. Now, if I decide that I don't need to use this for part of my weighting, I can always drag it back to the left, and it will remove it from that weighting scheme. One other note that you may encounter here is that you may get a message where it'll tell you that it can't be made, the weighting variable can't be made because the value or variable that it's based on has missing values. If that's the case, think back a moment to that conditional that we discussed earlier and that option to include missing. That's going to be your workaround for that. Now in this case, I do want to give this a name, so I'll call this gender test and today's date. I'll just repeat that here in the code. And now I do need to select whether or not I want to set this as the default weight variable, as well as the maximum number of times I'm going to allow the algorithm to run in order to create my weights. This may or may not matter to you. In fact, if you leave it alone, that's perfectly fine. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And MarketSight, as you can see, will process that request. And when it's complete, it's going to give me a little dialog where it gives me some additional information about my weighting variable. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click Done, and that will close that dialog. All right, perfect. So that brings us into our next section of today's discussion on variables and tips and tricks regarding variables to create segmented analysis. So one thing that may also occur when you're working with your variables is that you may realize that you need to make edits to those variables. For example, if I'm looking down here at the provider recommendation category, I can see, of course, that each of these variables has the word recommend and a dash. And that was great when I wasn't using categories, because, of course, without the categories, they all kind of look the same. But since I'm now using categories to split up my variables visually, I don't really need that recommend in there anymore. Now, the default way, of course, to edit this would be to click on that variable, make the change manually, and then click OK. MarketSight will, of course, think through that change, and that's all well and good, but there is, in fact, an easier way to do it, especially if you have to make changes for multiple variables. One of the most fabulous functions that we've recently added is going to be the ability to export a labeling file. So if you're familiar with the dataset labeling workbook, and you may well be, this is a new version of that workbook. Instead of being a blank workbook that you have to fill out from scratch, you instead want to choose to export this workbook from the variables page. Now the reason why is because it's actually going to be pre-filled with your variable data. As I open that up here, Excel's going to think about it for just a moment too long perhaps, but that's okay, it got with it. And now I can see all of my variable information already pre-filled for me. Now if I scroll down just a little bit, I will find those recommend variables. And of course, one of the nice things about Excel is that very easy ability to make multiple changes at once. But the other thing to consider would be the ability to categorize here as well. Now I pre-filled out a version of this workbook, so I shouldn't need to make edits today, so I won't bore you with my typing skills. So let's go ahead and find out if I did that correctly. Once you've made changes to your workbook, such as removing that recommend from that variable label, it's time to apply that workbook to the data set. So we do need to leave the variables page for that, but once you're on the datasets page, the idea is that you're going to look for the variable properties. You're going to get to that by going to datasets, you right-click, and you'll see a properties option right here. Underneath that properties dialog, you'll see information about your dataset, which, by the way, includes the number of respondents and variables that you currently have. But importantly for our purposes today, it's going to be where you can browse for a dataset labels file, aka that workbook that we just exported and modified. So I'm going to browse for a copy of that I saved earlier. Hopefully it's the one that I changed. And once I say OK, that's going to confirm those changes for all of those variables at once. MarketSight, of course, is going to check for updates to make sure that if anything is going to, say, change, say, by removing a variable or something like that, I'll be aware of it. If there are potential issues, it will let me know. Otherwise, I should see something like this occur, where it tells me that updates are in progress, and it gives me a little progress bar, and in this case, it jumped to 100, so I'm done. Perfect. So let's head back to that variables page, and let's see if I filled out my workbook correctly. I'm going to cross my fingers here. And there we have that recommendation category, and all of my variables no longer have the recommend with a dash right in front of them. So again, just because that one is very important, just to summarize, you can get a copy of that workbook by going to Export Labeling File here on the variables page. And again, that's going to get you that pre-filled workbook, which makes it much easier to edit a lot of variable labels, as well as categorize multiple variables at once. All right. So we've discussed, of course, a lot of things, but let's say, for example, we're moving on in our lives, a new wave of data has come in and we've appended grand. In that case, all of our work would automatically be copied over. But there are sometimes situations where you may receive an entirely new copy of the data set, and it's not necessarily appropriate to append it because it already has the previous wave of data in it. All right, well, that's great, but of course it doesn't have the work in it, so what can you do? In that case, we have options for that as well. I'm going to switch to a different copy of this data set where I've stripped out all of the variables and categorization and even crosstabs that I've created. So in this particular copy, you can see, of course, that everything is uncategorized again, grand, and I have no user-defined variables. That's also a little sad because, of course, nobody wants to remake those things. But you don't actually have to. So whenever you're uploading a new version of a data set, or even any data set that has an identical structure, you can click on the Import button here on the Variables page. That's going to load a dialog where you can select that previous version of the data set. So in this case, my original 2018 data set. And then I can choose what I'm looking to import. As you can see, that's really anything that I create in MarketSight. So any user-defined variables, any crosstabs in their charts, any data views, and also variable categories. So that's a key component there. When I click OK, that's going to begin the import process, and MarketSight will pop up the tasks list here on the far side. And when that's complete, I'm going to get a file that summarizes the success of that task. So this shouldn't take too long here. It looks like we're already halfway through. Once that completes, I do want to make sure that I open that file and show that to you, so that's why we're pausing here for just one moment. All right. Looks like the categories come over. That's a good sign. So I'm opening up that tasks list again, and let's take a look at that log file. This is, again, an Excel file, so I'm going to go ahead and open that in Excel. Excel's going to think about it, and here we are. So I do want to point out specifically that not only do I get a summary here on this first worksheet of the number of items I selected to import and the number of items that were successfully imported, but I do want to also point out there will be a worksheet for each kind of item that you try to import from one data set to another. The reason why this is important is because should it say, import was not successful, it will actually give you a note, a reason as to why that is. So it's an excellent means of figuring out, perhaps it didn't import because something is not present in the data set. This will give you that clue that you need in order to proceed. So do keep that in mind when you are importing from data set to data set. Now, the other thing I do want to point out in terms of convenience, so using and reusing different options here. Earlier in this little session today, we made a regrouping user-defined variable for my recommend variable here. I called it, top 2 communique, great. But of course, I happen to have more variables than just that one that need to have that grouping applied to them. So rather than reinvent the wheel and redo a new variable for each one of these guys, the better option is to select the checkbox that you see next to that reuse variable. This is going to bring up the reuse dialog here. And once you click on that, MarketSight is going to look through your data set. It's going to look for virtually everything that it can find that shares the same numeric value scale. So that's the key there. It does need to have the same value scale. In this case, I specifically want these guys in the recommendation category. So I'm going to select those. And if I wanted, I can rename them individually. For the sake of time, I'll just modify the suffix here, and I'll call this top 2. Now, you don't necessarily need to have a suffix. You can actually empty that box entirely, and that works as well. But essentially right now, what will happen is I should get variables for each of these guys with the little top 2 on the end. So I'm going to click OK. And my list is expanded, and I've now applied that setting with my top 2 and all others to each of the variables that I selected there. So that is a convenient means for reusing any sort of regrouping scheme that you have. All right, so we're right about at the end of our session here, and just as a summary, we've discussed categorizing and organizing data sets, as well as various shortcuts, such as right-clicking for creating new user-defined variables. We've discussed some tips and tricks for the variables themselves, such as the include missing option for conditionals. We've mentioned weighting, and we've taken a look at relabeling variables quickly and easily by utilizing the new dataset labeling workbook file that can be exported pre-filled with your dataset information. Finally, we also covered bringing over variables as well as other work that you've created by utilizing import, and then reusing any regrouping variable that you have with the reuse function. We're going to take our last couple of minutes here to address any questions that are relevant to the group as a whole. All right, so let's take a quick look here. All right, so we're taking just a quick look at the questions here. If there are questions that are not specific to everyone, we will address those with you via email. All right, so we have a couple of questions about weighting. What are some common reasons for why users would use a weight variable? So if a user needs to create a weight variable, reason why they would likely do that is because their sample is not quite representative of their target. So, say for example with our gender, and we wanted 50-50%, it turned out that the sample that we had gotten was a little skew, favored, I think, the female gender, if I recall correctly. So weighting would adjust that balance between those factors to better adjust my sample size to represent my target. Now, in the case of creating multiple factors in weighting, you can weight on multiple variables. Those are going to be the different variables that you drag over. So you can drag over multiple variables. Just remember that each one of those does need to equal up to 100%. All right, so we did have a question as well about conditional variables and editing conditionals. The answer is yes, of course, you can certainly edit your conditional logic. So in that case, let me go ahead and actually show you that real quick, since that is a common option or common need. So I'm going to go ahead and show all of my categories here. And I'm going to open up my conditional here. So let's say in this case I needed to change some of my logic within my conditional values. In this case, what I want to do is I want to click on that particular value. I then want to select the part of the logic that I need to change. So if I select this particular bit of logic, for example, that's going to populate these drop-downs. So I'm now able to say, change my option, and click on Replace Selected Clause. So that should be very quick and easy to do. You would simply, of course, click OK to confirm those changes, and OK to save that variable change as a whole. So that's very easy to do. All right. So we are taking a look now. Any other variables? All right, we've had a question about variable orders. So yes, when creating most user-defined variable types, the variable that you create, the user-defined variable, will go at the bottom of the list. Categorization at this point is the best means of moving variables within the list. Otherwise, the variable is going to show up in the order in which it was created. So essentially survey order first, and then new variables at the end. The only exception to this is multiple response variables, which show up above their predecessor variables. All right, and then one last question, since we have just hit our last moment in time here. How will you know the weighting is being applied? Excellent question. So you have a couple of options there, but in short, when you are using a weight variable within a crosstab, you'll actually see a note up at the top of the crosstab that tells you what weighting variable is in use. And should you ever right-click on a variable within the variables page here, you can also see a quick note up at the top here if a weighting variable is in use. All right, great. We did have a number of additional questions, so we'll follow up with those with you via email. We do thank you for coming to our very quick training today on some tips and tricks with segmented analysis with variables, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, and goodbye.